First of all, thank you PSF for having me. Special thank you to the President, Mr. Hamid. I know it's a Sunday morning and must take a lot to come out. Some of you may have stayed up to watch the football. So, so I can understand if some of you are still feeling a little groggy. But I'll try and keep this, I'll try and keep this light and, entertaining. So first of all, very inspired by what I heard about PSF. I think the whole theme around connect, change and serve, right? And all the objectives you outlined, I think two things. One, I think is, I think one of the things which a lot of people who do good work in India tend not to do is to give themselves a little bit of visibility. People need to know the good work you're doing, right? They need to know. So all that I saw, all the 5 objectives and the work you're doing and the fact that you've done this now for the last close to 14 years, truly, truly commendable. And I think all of those involved with PSF, I think you deserve a big round of applause. It's rare to see people coming together selflessly. As your president said, do this with passion, with commitment, and focus for such a long period of time. So usually what happens is people start, it goes on for some time, and then it dies off, right? But keeping it going for 13 years is, 13 or 14 years is truly, truly commendable. So I've been asked to talk about, this theme of around emotional intelligence. I think this has now become more than ever critical, right? How many of this audience here is less than 30 years of age? Can you put your hands up? Okay. So there are old guys like me and there are young people like you, okay? And I'm going to make a contrast. So as I said, I intend to make this, I don't want to give you a boring, heavy duty, death by PowerPoint. I have a few slides, but I'll keep it light. The whole idea about why I asked you that question, one of the things you realize between today's, what you call, millennial, Gen Z and all of that is I think, and I'm going to relate this to, how many of you have heard of Maslow's pyramid? Some of you? Yeah? So and can someone in the audience quickly tell us what are the 5 pillars of Maslow? Leadership coaches are not allowed to speak. Okay. So the 5 pillars in Maslow, anyone? Okay. Kalim, go ahead. You need a mic? Okay, let's move along. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Security need.
Yes.
Team need at the apex.
Yes.
Yeah. So at the bottom of pyramid, it is
Food, clothing, shelter. Yeah. Yeah. Second.
And I believe security need.
Today, I think it is not food, clothing, shelter. It is Wi-Fi and mobile. Okay. Anyway.
Roti, kapda, and mobile.
Okay. What do you have on top? Right on top. Self-actualization. Okay. So now the reason I brought that out, I think one of the things you'll realize today, getting a little more serious, right, is that today I don't think young people do things only for money. Okay. They look for things beyond money. They connect to causes. They connect to other people deeply. And unlike people of my generation, right, for those of you who've been around for many years, will realize India has gone through profound change in the last many years, right? So when we were growing up, all that we were looking for was, let's get ourselves a good education, let's get into a good job, and then move on, right? So the number of young people today who go off the beaten track, go out and do things different has changed dramatically. So that's what I want to cover here in today's theme. Okay, so I'll start with this quote by Maya Angelou. Just go back to the previous slide, please. Okay, Now some of you would have heard of her. She was a civil rights activist, a poet, an author. She wrote seven autobiographies, right? And one of the things, she wrote a book about The Cage Bird Will Sing. That's her most famous book. She actually grew up, she's a black activist who grew up in the south of the US. And as you know, till almost the late 60s, there was racial segregation in the US. There was tremendous discrimination. And she fought all of that in a very non-violent way. She was one of the inspirations for Martin Luther King. And also most famously, when Bill Clinton became president in 1993, she recited a poem, right? The only two people who have recited poems when presidents of the US have got inaugurated, one was Robert Frost. Robert Frost you would have heard of, which is, woods to go, many miles to go, the woods lovely, dark and deep, and the other was Michelangelo. Now reflect on this statement. So I think this is profound, because I think today it's not about what you say, it's not about what you did, but it is about engaging with people at a much deeper level, right? Think about, how many of you have now worked for more than 5 years in your jobs? So please reflect on this statement. It's about how do you connect with people, right? So for example, you have colleagues, you have a boss whom you work with. So obviously you will build deep relationships with them because you're spending pretty much half your day with them. So this whole thing about, making a connection, about feeling, right? Not just about doing a bunch of tasks and going out and executing what you're told to do, is what she's talking about. Okay, this is a busy slide, but I'll try and keep it simple. All of you can read better than me, but I'll just try and kind of summarize this. So essentially, earlier people used to talk about IQ, right? We all know about this Mensa test, right? The Mensa test, which is about measuring intelligence and so on, which is about knowledge, skills, an ability to perform certain tasks, etc. And if you have a IQ of more than 140, for example, chances are you will be recognized as a genius, right? So today the focus is not so much on having an IQ of 140, because there are many instances we know that people who have very high IQ, and I can give you some examples. So for example, if you take the most famous scientist of our times, Einstein, right? Einstein was undoubtedly a genius, right? Because only a genius can come up with, E is equal to mc square and explain such complex, and arcane and abstruse topics in a form which people can understand. But he had a very, very difficult personal life because he could not connect with people, right? He had a troubled childhood, he had a troubled marriage, and towards the end of his life, he recognized that he had to be more than just very good at the theory of relativity, but also the ability to connect to people. So that's the first part. Now coming back to the point about, I think somebody asked a question. I think Kalim asked a question at that time about what is EQ, right? If you can just put the slide back on, please. And if you see, there's a summary there, which is about the ability to perceive, evaluate, and control emotions, right? So perceive meaning understand. So particularly during COVID, I saw that a lot of people went through a lot of turmoil. Okay, a lot of two things. This whole thing about the lack of social connect. So many young people, for example, who had come from outside of their hometowns and working together in working locked up in a small room with absolutely physically isolated from others, etc. So that whole social bonding, connect, etc. was missing. That was one part. The second is sadly there were so many people who had to be hospitalized. Some people suffered even worse than that. So that was a challenge in terms of being able to understand what others were going through. And one thing I saw many leaders, and I think the first thing which I saw many great leaders do during this time, and I think it's become much more prevalent now, is before you start talking to somebody at work and saying, "Aaj ka kya kaam hai? Have you done your job?" It started with a conversation about how are you today. Okay, that's a very simple thing. It's a very, very simple thing, but think about it. When you go up to somebody in the morning, you say good morning and how are you today, I think it just creates a very different level of connect with people, right? And I just wish more people do it. We tend to be very, very task oriented, very, very, aaj ka kaam karna hai, target hai, we have to achieve something, we have to deliver a certain level of output and all of that. But I think that output will get delivered better if we build that level of connect. And that connect starts with a simple thing like, how are you today? Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is about being able to look at these four components, which is being able to look at perceiving emotions, being able to think and not allow emotion to cloud your thinking, right? Because emotion can be both play a positive role. If you're positively motivated, you'll do outstanding. But if you're down in the dumps, you're feeling depressed, or feeling under the weather, you may not be able to deliver much, right? And then, of course, understanding what the other person is going through, right? So this is the whole thing about this. How many of you read this book by Daniel Goleman? Some. Okay, so again, as professionals, I think it's something which I think should now be made required reading by everybody. Yeah? So there are two books which I recommend to most people. One is a book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And the other one is this book by Daniel Goleman called Emotional Intelligence. Right? So it's worth reading. If you don't have the time to read, you are one of those people who can. There are audio books available. So when you are doing your morning walk or treadmill or whatever, you can read it. Okay, so he talks about 6 leadership styles, and I'll try and give you some examples of each of these to try and put context. Right now, as you know, there's the World Cup football on. There are 2 test matches on, England versus Pakistan, Australia versus West Indies, and today there is India versus Bangladesh. Okay, so I'll try and relate all of these leadership styles to some extent, to the extent possible, to cricket, and so that to some extent it will resonate. Right? Cricket and a little bit of other leaders as well. Can you just put on the slide, please? So Daniel Goleman talks about 6 different types of leadership. So he talks about commanding leadership. Okay, so the first one is about being very directive. So you just tell people, you do this. I will tell you what I know best as the leader. I will tell you what you have to do, and you just follow. Typically, the kind of leadership which is exemplified, for example, in the army, right? Because in the army or anywhere in the armed forces, one of the things you recognize is you're asking people to put their lives at stake, right? It takes a lot. We don't realize it many times, but every day a soldier who's in Siachen or in Kargil or somewhere else is putting himself on the line every day, right? Because one is there's the risk of the enemy. The second is there's the risk of the elements which are likely to create issues for you. So the thing about commanding leadership is typically something which you'll see in the army, and today it is increasingly you find that very few of those. I mean, there are examples. So obviously we have people like, for example, the chap in Russia, Putin, right? The chap in China, Xi. Some of you may also have some examples closer to home, but at the risk of being politically correct, I won't say those names, but you can infer where I'm coming from, right? People who basically my way or the highway. So those are the commanding types of leaders, right? The second one is affiliative, right? Which is about people who want to essentially focus on putting together things around harmony, not so much focused on results. And typically this is the kind of thing which you will find, for example, in a lot of NGOs, for example, right? Because the focus there is on doing good, working together as a team, being collaborative, and sometimes not so much focus on outcomes or results, right? So that's another model. There's a small mistake here. The democratic has come up twice. I'll talk about it as we go along. The third one is about democracy, right? Which is about working together cooperatively, cohesively, and bringing everybody together, right? And I'll give you one example which some of you will relate to. This is something which the Japanese do very well, and I'll explain this to you with an example. So in most Japanese corporations, they follow a method called ringi. Okay, and I'll explain what ringi is. So what happens in ringi is that if there's any major project which has to be done, right, whether it is in the government, whether it is in the public sector, the private sector, etc., they follow this consensual process called ringi. What they do in ringi is, so let's say there are 40 people in a department implementing some major initiative, for example. Yeah. So if they're trying to implement this initiative, what they try and do is to mitigate the risk of failure, right? They make sure that everyone in the team, all the 40 or 50 people who are in the team, who are involved in that implementation, buy into the concept first. So let's take an example. All of you are from IT or some connection to IT? Most? Okay. So I'll take one example. So let's say you decide to implement a ERP or CRM system in your companies, as an example. So as you know, suppose you have a timeline saying in the next 12 months we'll implement this SAP or Salesforce or some system like that. Many times you have situations where the 12 months can extend to 15, 18 and so on, because several hurdles which we don't envisage in the beginning come up and can derail the project, right? So what the Japanese do is, before they commit to doing a project, they spend a lot of time on getting everybody in the team first to look at what are the potential risks in implementation of a particular platform. Second is, what are the mitigation measures, meaning what can go wrong, what can we anticipate we need to do to make sure that we fix it, right? That's the second part. And third is, till everybody signs literally on the dotted line, we will not start the project, okay? And I can tell you from personal experience, which is, it has two sides. There are flip side to this, which is, you will find, if anyone has worked with any Japanese entity, you will find sometimes that आपको लगेगा कि why do these guys take so long to do anything? The reason for that is not that they are slow, right? But they are trying to say that we want to start a project, it's 12 months, we want to finish it on 12 months. Right? You all know the example of the trains, right? The trains are not even seconds late, forget minutes, right? And why is that? Because they believe in meticulous planning and building consensus through democratic way. It's not about somebody is senior, somebody is junior, but get everybody aligned to the mission. So coming back to this example, the whole intent is to make sure that people come together and drive, right? So I'm assuming an organization, for example, PSF, which is a voluntary organization, by design has to be necessarily democratic, right? Because you have to get people together who come from different backgrounds, who have different interests, right? Who have different styles of working, have to come together. So that's the third example. The fourth one is coaching, right? So I'm going to use a cricket example. So one example from India and one example from our neighbors across. Okay. So the example from India, I think we've had many great cricket captains in India, but undoubtedly the most successful guy is a guy called Dhoni, right? And if you see, Dhoni was not necessarily the best player in the team, right? But the fact that so many people, so you take a Virat Kohli, you take a Rohit Sharma, right, etc. All of them actually flowered under his regime, his reign. They all came up, they all started playing under him. He allowed them to fail. Okay, he was obviously behind them, supported them all the way through, and helped them to become better players, better people, right, and deliver great outcomes. Right. Another example across the border. This chap called Imran Khan. Right. Again, I think everyone knows that historically, the most difficult job on earth, right, is probably to be the captain of Pakistan. Right. And I'll tell you a story. I was recently reading Mr. Wasim Akram has come out with this new book. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's a book called Sultan. Right. And he said, when he became captain, he had 7 people who had been captains before. Wasim, first test when he became captain, he had 7 people who became captain, and the remaining 4 guys were all aspiring to be vice captains, and then become captains, right? So very difficult job. I'm just giving you that as an example to illustrate how difficult it must have been. But then, if you remember, 1992, the World Cup, right, which was Imran's last tournament, Pakistan was virtually on the brink of elimination, right? And then he inspired his team. He said, boys, we must fight like tigers, which they did, and then they won, right? So essentially being able to manage beyond that would have been a tough job, right? And then to manage other guys, who were all, at various stages of their career. But he was truly inspirational in building out coaching and showing how he can bring together a bunch of individuals to align to a common cause. Next. Let's talk about visionary. So again, I'll give 2 examples. One is an example from near home. So obviously, if you take somebody like, let's say Gandhi, right, back about 80 or 90 years ago, when independence was just a distant dream, right? And how do you, inspire people who are under the British? How do you inspire them using the power of non-violence, ahimsa, satyagraha, and all of that to rally to a common cause? So that's visionary. How do you get people aligned to a certain vision, a certain thought process, and do it in a peaceful way, right? And the last one is about pace setting, right? So I'll give you another example from pace setting, which again I go back to a cricketing example. So if you think about probably the most successful Indian captain overseas has been Virat Kohli, right? So first time after 70 years winning in Australia, right? And under his leadership, we came close to winning a series in England, right? So Virat was not the best captain tactically, right? But I think he inspired by the power of his own performance, right? He used to try to be the best guy he could be, and make sure that people follow and rally around his example. So these are the 6 different types of leadership. So I'm going to ask you to do one exercise. Maybe you can pick somebody in the audience and ask them to think about the leaders they work with and which these leaders fall into which of these 6 buckets, right? So let's start with, is there anyone who wants to volunteer and come up on stage? Please. How are we doing on time?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, PSF, for this wonderful summit. And listening to Srinivas Rao sir is an honor. Well, actually, in my long career, I have worked with different types of people. I would recollect the recent one, which I worked until 2021, was a Dutch guy. He says, as Srinivas Rao sir was mentioning about one of the leadership styles, my way or highway. Either you do like this, or you're out of my team. look for another one. So I believe this is an autocratic style of leadership,
Commanding style.
commanding style. So this is something which is very negatively affecting the team, and it does not help the team at all. And gradually, people started leaving. And one of the recent example is Elon Musk. He says you have to work for 12 hours a day or 14 hours a day,
18
and
hours a week.
18 hours a week, 82 hours a week or something. And then people started leaving the company. Mass resignations followed. So this is again, bad type of leadership, I would say. One of the biggest leaders which I've seen is Mahatma Gandhi. He has led a very divided nation, I would say, or multiple states where India was in bits and pieces, and Maharajas and different parts, and he was the uniting factor who brought together all the states and different types of leaders. The leaders from across the border, they also were into the fold. Well, later on it got split, etc. But that is a leadership I would really love, visionary leadership.
Yeah.
I would love to.
Thank you.
Sir, taking this opportunity, I would like to ask a question, if you allow me.
Sure.
Well, among this group, we have several entrepreneurs. And as a chairman of T-Hub, president of T-Hub, what is one thing you would like to advise the budding entrepreneurs or the already existing entrepreneurs? What is something which you would like them to inculcate in their organization in terms of values? Financials is something which everybody will focus on. In terms of values, talking of the EQ, what is that you would like to advise? Thank
Sure.
you.
Sure, thank you. Great question. So I think first of all, so when you talk about leadership, first of all, leaders should have what I call the servant mentality, and I'll explain that. The servant mentality is about you're a leader. In many cases, some people become leaders because of dynasty. Okay, so I'm not going there. I'm saying if you become a leader by merit, if you become a leader, the first thing I say, all leaders should have a servant mentality. And what I mean by a servant mentality is, I'm not saying you have to be necessarily deferential or obsequious or whatever, but it is about, remember, you have a responsibility to serve your stakeholders, right? And who are those stakeholders? First and foremost stakeholder as a leader, when you're leading an entity, is your people. Okay, so you have to be, it's almost this whole concept of you are the trustee of your people, right? You are the trustee of your people. So looking after your people, I'm not saying don't hold them accountable for performance, that's important. But be able to do it in a nice and a humane way, right? And not the my way or highway sort of thing, right? So the first thing is servant mentality. Now coming back to values, so I think clearly any organization which has to build to scale, if you think about it, clearly collaboration is critical, integrity is critical, humility is critical, right? Vision is critical, being able to paint a big picture and show that what we are doing today is going to lead to a brighter and a better future tomorrow is critical. So if you ask me, these are the 4 or 5 things. So one is obviously collaboration, second is humility, third is integrity, fourth is vision, and of course, as leaders, we also have to be able to walk the talk. Okay? Meaning not just about talking, but also about executing and lead by example. Okay, show people how this can be done. Yeah. So I think I have just 2 more slides. I know I'm conscious that we started late. Okay, and I was just telling Kaleem when you were here, Hyderabad mein, I'm a returning Hyderabadi. I grew up here, I studied here, then went to Bangalore, built 2 businesses in Bangalore, and then came back here after 27 years in Bangalore. So the one thing about Hyderabad which I wish we can change is about starting on time, right? And Hamid ji, this is called Mauke Pe Chauka. So I try and tell everybody wherever I go, when you talk about professionalism, and the theme is around being professional, it's important for us to value others' time, right? And one of the characteristics of being able to value others' time is showing up on time. Okay. Sorry, I just thought I should make that point. Okay. So I think this whole thing about being, leader and being able to build strong emotional bonds with the team is critical. So I'm not saying all the work you do is not about, linking it to performance and outcomes, but when you have a strong bond, right, with people, they will stretch themselves much more to do things beyond the regular call of duty to deliver great outcomes. And you will be surprised if you think of every single instance when people, I'm sure even in putting together this event, right, you would have seen that many people would have stretched beyond the call of normal duty, put in a lot of hours, because they were inspired by a common sense of purpose, a common sense of, we want to make this a really, good, great event, right? So that's about the power of emotion. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is obviously and evident, I think, made many points about the fact that we need to, think about leaders particularly need to be very conscious of becoming a lot more emotionally connected to their people, being able to perceive emotions, being able to manage their own emotions, because like I think he said, one of the challenges as an entrepreneur is, in your heart that sometimes you're fighting a very, very hard, lonely battle, but it is important to put up a brave face type of thing, right? But there's also, there's one more book which I'm going to ask you to read. This is by a guy called Patrick Lencioni. Okay, I don't know how many of you have read Patrick Lencioni. So he talks about the concept of naked leadership, right? It is also okay for leaders to show sometimes that they can be vulnerable. We have this myth that all leaders should be, alpha people, meaning they should bottle up all their emotions within, etc., and not, show it out. But it is okay sometimes to even show that you also are, you are also human. You also go through, periods where you feel less than, optimal at, in terms of what you're doing. So, but that's something which we should all be mindful of. Okay, so the last two slides. So basically, trying to summarize, what the whole thing about emotional intelligence is. It's about being self-aware, being about knowing who you are, and knowing what is driving you, right, and being able to communicate that. Making sure that you keep on top of your emotions all the time, right? Then obviously it's about the power of motivation. It's about being empathetic. Now empathetic is very simple. The best definition I've heard about being empathetic is put yourself in the other person's shoes. And one question which a lot of people ask me many times, so I always say, listen, the basic principle of how you relate to other people is very simple. One simple principle, which is treat others as you would like to be treated. Okay, that's about empathy, right? Putting yourself in others' shoes and treat others as you would like to be treated. So if you want to be treated politely, then treat others politely. You want others to be humble with you, please be humble with them, etc. Right? And the last one, of course, is this whole thing about social skills. Right? More than ever, the world is one connected village. Okay, we are all in this together, and today, thanks to technology, we've learned how to work remotely. We've learned how to work from home. We're doing so many wonderful things. But it's about being able to connect, collaborate, and serve. Next, please. So I think last slide. So I think what does, if we all become a little better at this whole theme around emotional intelligence, what is it likely to lead to? So I think it's obviously about the team will perform better. The decision making will be better because it's much more consensual, right? And people will align. They don't see it as top down or diktat coming, but united around a common purpose, a common vision, etc. and then obviously less stress, right? All of you know, particularly in the last 2 years, mental health is now becoming a theme of conversation. Earlier it used to be taboo. People used to say, listen, if you're feeling down, even if you're going through, we all know, right? India has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. And part of the problem there is because it is you are perceived to be weak if you go and tell somebody that you are not feeling great. Okay, so that's something which has to change. And that will change when leaders become a little more empathetic and take into account that emotional intelligence is a critical component of their job to support other people. Right? And this will obviously lead to better well-being. Next. Last. Yeah. So that's it. So I just thought, Sunday morning, and the hall is dark, so some of you may have nodded off, but that's okay. And I try to give you some examples which I hope will help you understand. And I think if each one of you can make a personal commitment that the people you work with, okay, you will start to be a little more empathetic about their work, both as leaders as well as colleagues, we'll have a better world and a better place to live in. Thank you.
Thank you.